everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Bloomreach's Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable. My name is Michelle DeMeo, and I will be hosting our event today. I'm joined here by my colleague, Ian Burgers, as well as our two panelists, Jason Goldberg, Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at Publicis, as well as Brian Walker, Chief Strategy Officer here at Bloomreach. Jason, thank you both for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
Awesome to be here.
Some of you may already be familiar with Commerce Pulse if you've joined us for our summer or our spring quarterly roundtables, and if so, we are very happy to have you back. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, Commerce Pulse is a quarterly event that highlights data we've gathered here at Bloomreach, the world's #1 commerce experience cloud. Bloomreach powers commerce experiences for hundreds of brands and retailers around the world, meaning the data we collect provides a really compelling look at the current state of commerce, in addition to providing insight into what's ahead. We gather data on a monthly basis to uncover the top trends in e-commerce, which are then detailed in our Commerce Pulse blog posts, all available on our website, bloomreach.com. Today, we'll talk about what we've seen in the data this past quarter, September through November, along with a touch of December. We'll break today's roundtable down into 4 sections: a general overview, an overview of the holiday season, and then a deep dive into retail, followed by a forward-looking discussion of 2022 trends. So with that, we will get today's discussion started. As I mentioned, before we get into our holiday trends, which are really a big focus of today's event, we also wanted to start with a broader view of e-commerce over the past month so that Brian and Jason can share any general thoughts on this past quarter. So Ian, can you go ahead and get us started by sharing our November data?
Thanks, Michelle. So yeah, to start, let's set the scene by having a look at the overall year-to-date numbers for November 2021. And here we can see that sales are up in both regions, 31.32% in North America and 23.78% in the UK and in the EU. Traffic is also up in both regions, 8.52% in North America and 14.8% in the UK and in the EU. Conversion rate is down, 6.74% in North America and 1.58% in the UK and the EU. And average order size is up in both regions, quite a notable 30.6% in North America and 11.5% in the UK and in the EU. Now let's take a look at the November year-over-year data. So this is comparing November 2021 to November 2020. And again, sales are up in both regions, 3.51% in North America and 6.38% in the UK and in the EU. Traffic is down a notable 19.60% in North America, and it's also down 6.93% in the UK and in the EU. Conversion rate, however, is up 11.26% in North America, but it's down 9.6% in the UK and in the EU. And again, we can see that average order size is up in both regions, 15.91% in North America and 25.70% in the UK and in the EU. So with those November numbers covered, I'll pass it back to you, Michelle.
Wonderful, thank you, Ian. Okay, Brian, let's get right into it. What stands out to you about the past month and the past quarter, really, in e-commerce?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can kind of see it reflected in the year-to-date numbers versus the year-over-year November numbers. We have seen, in a sense, a deceleration in e-commerce growth the later we've gotten into the year. And I think in some respects that reflects where we were, in a sense, with the pandemic as we entered into November. And you can see the difference between the regions kind of reflected in that as well, with more reopening, more sort of consumers getting out and about, and certainly retailers also looking to kind of incentivize consumers to get back out into stores. And even the media, in a sense, really amplifying that with stories around, potential shipping delays and and supply chain issues, in a sense, kind of encouraging consumers to kind of get out and about. And of course, many consumers were eager in some ways to have that kind of an opportunity, and that's really great. But we can see how that played out in the November numbers. I think we also see the impact of supply chain and inflationary pressures, including labor costs, reflected in retailers discounting far less, and also in some cases increasing prices at the same time, really to protect margins. And you can see that also reflected in the numbers. So, the numbers are kind of a little all over the place when you compare the two regions. And I think it really kind of reflects where we were with the pandemic in each continent, so to speak, with Europe, unfortunately, dealing with, Delta variant increases in COVID infection in November, and in some cases, even having some version of lockdowns, or in a sense, curfews, if you will, impacting, consumer behavior. Whereas in North America, kind of the opposite. Now, of course, we'll see how that plays out. We'll probably discuss that a little later here in the webinar, how that plays out as we look, past Thanksgiving and into the rest of the holiday season.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jason, what about you? What are your thoughts on the past month, the past quarter?
Yeah, I like to joke that this year has been 24 months long. It both feels like it, but in many ways, I think it is, because when we compare this year's sales, either year to date or November, to last year, we have to remember how what an outlier and abnormal last year was, right? And so comparing it to the first sort of traditional behavior, we have to go back 2 years. And so since last year, we had such a huge spike in digital behaviors that was necessitated because of COVID. The year over years we're seeing this year are against the outlier data for last year. And digital got dramatically accelerated everywhere, but even much more so in Europe. And so when you kind of look at those year over years, you're comparing how high up in the air we are this year compared to Mount Everest last year in Europe and Mount McKinley here in the United States. So it's interesting. It's going. I hope next year when things are a little back to normal, we'll look at kind of the 3-year trends, and they probably will look a little more familiar to us than some of these things do now.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciated those analogies. That was very on point. I'm going to shift us over to holiday. I know that was a quick overview, but to be honest, everyone is really here to hear about the holiday. So Ian, can you go ahead and start sharing some of our holiday season data?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, let's definitely dive into that, because we all know that's what everybody's here for. So let's start with an overview of the holiday season results. And let's first have a look at the holiday season year over year, so comparing it to 2020. And here the holiday season is defined as October 1st through December 3rd. And we can see that sales are up in both regions, 12% in North America and 9% in the EU. Traffic is down 13% in North America, but it's up 6% in the EU. And conversion rates, however, are up 5% in North America, but down 16% in the UK and in the EU. And again, we can see that average order size is up in both regions, 22% in North America and 23% in the UK and the EU. Now, I think it's also quite interesting to not only take a look at the year-over-year numbers comparing 2021 to 2020, but also have a look at comparing it to 2019. So that is the pre-pandemic holiday season. So now again, we are looking at the numbers for October 1st through December 3rd, but then comparing 2021 to 2019. And here we can see that sales in North America are up a very significant 40%. And sales are also up in the EU by 9%. Traffic is up a notable 62% in North America and 35% in the EU. Conversion rates, however, are down in both regions, 6% in North America and 5% in the EU. And average order size is up only 1% in North America, and it's down 5% in the UK and the EU. And now let's zoom in a little bit on the Cyber 5, really those core days from Thanksgiving through Cyber Monday. And let's again compare 2021 to 2020. And here we can actually see that sales were down 2% in North America, but up 17% in the EU. Traffic is again down 21% in North America, and traffic in the EU is up 6%. Conversion rate is up 10% in North America, but down 14% in the UK and in the EU. And average order size is up 12% in North America and up 29% in the UK and the EU. And now let's again compare Thanksgiving through Cyber Monday, so those Cyber 5 days, to 2019, so the pre-pandemic year. And here we can see that sales are up 10% year over year in North America and 16% in the UK and in the EU. Traffic is up 25% in North America and a very significant 48% in the UK and the EU. Conversion rate is down in both regions, 18% in North America and 26% in the UK and the EU. And average order size is up 7% in both regions. Now, finally, I wanted to share some additional interesting data points that we found. First of all, we saw that during the holiday season, mobile accounted for 32% of sales, so about 1/3. But during the rest of the year, mobile actually accounted for 41% of sales. So we actually saw a bit of a decrease for mobile sales during the holiday season. An additional interesting data point is that across North America, the EU and the UK, most purchases during the Cyber 5 days, so during Thanksgiving through Cyber Monday, were actually made between 8 p.m. and midnight. So quite a lot of evening shopping. Well, with the holiday data discussed, I'll pass it back to you because I'm very interested what our panelists have to say about this.
Thank you, Ian, as am I. So obviously we still have a few weeks left of the holiday season, thankfully, because I have not done any of my shopping, but we're already seeing a lot of important indicators here, I think. So Jason, if we could start with you, what are your takeaways from the holiday season so far?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. It's especially interesting to think about some of the differences between the EU and the US, but in the US in particular, we have some really severe supply chain shortages and concerns coming into holiday. So more than any holiday season I can remember, retailers were very serious about trying to minimize the spikes. What they didn't want is you waiting to the last minute to go shopping and not be able to get the gift you wanted, which I'm horrified to hear you haven't started your shopping yet. And they also didn't want to sell like everything in a 1-day or 5-day period and have to get a huge quantity of orders through the last mile at the same time and run into the sort of delivery constraints that we had last year that was sort of Shipageddon. So retailers started their Black Friday promotions in October this year. We're comping against e-commerce last year when Amazon had Prime Day in October. Ordinarily, retailers play this game of promotion chicken, where they offer a deal on Black Friday and they say, this is the best deal of the year. You should buy now. Don't wait till later and buy from someone else. Buy from me today. Trust me, it's the lowest price. And then, a week later, when that retailer hasn't hit their numbers, they drop their price lower. And that typically happens every holiday season. This year, they were really serious about it. They had less stuff, so they were going to promote it. They were going to discount it less. And they really wanted to dissuade that peak shopping on Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And the data kind of bears out that mostly worked, that those 5 days are still huge days. They're still outsized importance. But it is a diminishing importance, and you look at the whole holiday, and it's more robust, and that Cyber 5 is a less robust component of it.
I'm curious. I know we're going to get to future looking later today, but when you consider all the changes that were made this year to mitigate some of those outside factors, how much of those changes do you think we're going to see continue into holiday seasons of the future? And how much of those changes are really just, particular to this year?
That is a great question. And honestly, I don't know the answer. Part of it's going to depend. The supply chain challenges are not a blip. They're not going to end. They're not just based on holiday demand, and they're not going to end in January. I certainly hope we're in a better supply chain situation in holiday of 2022, but it's hard to anticipate exactly what it looks like. I'll be honest, retail and promotions are kind of an arms race, right? When people learn that they can sell stuff earlier, next year they're going to need to comp against this year. So they got some more October sales than they're used to. They got more sales in early November than they're used to. They're not going to want to return to the normal cadence last year. And so I do think next year will be significantly impacted by the outcome from this year. And then it frankly is it's easier to be operationally efficient and therefore more profitable when you spread this demand around more days. So I think the glass has been kind of broken on holiday being a 5-day season, and more retailers are gonna have broader marketing and promotion strategies for a longer season for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think the supply chain issues themselves will probably start to improve late spring and into summer. So by fall and holiday of next year, it's likely those are not necessarily what's impacting this. But I do expect, just as Jason shared there, that retailers and brands are going to look to move holiday earlier, right? That's going to be a part of their promotional cadence, and it'll be a key piece of the marketing. And we have to recognize that the pandemic remains very unpredictable, but we also face labor shortages. And as you said, Jason, trying to smooth out the demand, whether you're fulfilling, through your warehouse and through the logistics providers, or even fulfilling through your stores, that's a real concern this year, likely to continue. And then, frankly, we don't know, obviously, the impact of some of the inflationary pressures and price increases and other things that are unlikely to mitigate quickly. And those will also have an impact on demand, as we as consumers all respond to sort of that changing landscape. So we are still, I'd say, in kind of turbulent, hard to predict waters, so to speak, as we look into next year. But the supply chain issues in and of themselves, which were kind of acute, obviously, this year, it may mitigate. And certainly, I think many retailers and brands are also evaluating their sourcing strategies, their concentration in certain markets where they were manufacturing that led to some of the challenges this year. So there's going to be a lot of different things that kind of play a role in mitigating some of the supply chain issues specifically.
Well, that's a good thing. I certainly thought I would never talk about or care as much about the supply chain as I did. Brian, is there anything you want to add on the Cyber 5 specifically? I know we've talked a lot about how the holiday season has changed and how the Cyber 5 has changed in that context, but looking at those numbers and in comparison to pre-pandemic levels, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jason covered the fact, and we already talked about, like in North America, kind of moving the shopping holidays, if you will, and promotional cadence earlier, and a lot of messaging out there in October or even into September, really encouraging consumers to buy early. What's also interesting, though, is to see the effects of American consumer cultural imperialism on the UK and Europe, and just start to see how this period of time has also become kind of an important promotional period for UK and Europe, and many European consumers, in a sense, kind of responding to that as well. So it was really interesting to see the numbers as well reflected in the UK and Europe, and we start to see that happen, just like we saw Singles Day start to have some impact in North America, although less so, I think, this year. It's interesting to see how, we've kind of got this global social media and media landscape and marketing landscape now, and how that's, in a sense, translating across continents, even though obviously Thanksgiving is probably kind of a strange concept for many UK and Europeans. They probably watched enough rom-coms to know what it's about, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see the impact of American kind of marketing cadences outside of the United States as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I really thought was interesting was that mobile shopping accounted for less sales during the holiday season than it did for the rest of the year. Jason, and then maybe Brian, if you have anything to add there, I'm just curious as to why you guys think that might have been, or how retailers are maybe going to factor that into their plans moving forward, if at all.
Yeah, that is a really interesting thing, and I'll be honest, I am slightly perplexed. Ordinarily, we expect consumers to shop on desktop browsers or laptop browsers more during work hours, and on mobile devices more during off work hours, right? And so in this new world where we live in our office, there's a lot less of a hard line between that work environment and that home environment. And so it does kind of throw the usual patterns out the window a little bit. It is harder to complete your shopping tasks right now because, although I would argue the biggest, best retailers have done a pretty good job mitigating the supply chain challenges, there still are significantly more out of stocks than you're used to. So you still are doing more substitutions, looking at more places to find your item, doing more things. And the more complicated your shop, the harder you have to work for that shop, the more likely you are to work to move from that mobile device to that desktop. So I certainly don't have any evidence to support this, but I do think that this kind of mobile slowing down is a pandemic anomaly. I'll be really interested to see what happens next year.
Yeah, I think, mobile, obviously, people are more likely to be shopping on their mobile when they're on a commute, right? Or they're out and about, and they're going to use that as a way to, gain inspiration or find product, et cetera, or convert online when they see something offline, all those kinds of things happening. But I think it's about power shopping in a sense, as Jason said, right? And it's about having multiple browsers open and being able to more easily perhaps navigate, when you're kind of in that power shopping mode than on your iPad or on your phone. Doesn't mean it's not, a huge point of inspiration and conversion, but I think it's just reflects somewhat the season, but obviously also the pandemic, as Jason shared.
Yeah. Power shopping, I love that term. Okay, Brian, I hate to call you out, but I'm going to have to for this next part. During our last Commerce Pulse segment, you had some pretty strong predictions about what we could expect for holiday this year. And obviously things have changed quite a bit since then, but I would love to hear, are you surprised with where we are now with holiday based on what you thought we would be at?
Yeah, I think it's thank you so much for calling me out like that, Michelle. I was pretty bullish heading into holiday that we would see, continued strong online retail growth. I think there's just so many different variables. I did a podcast episode kind of breaking that down recently, and there's just, so many things that I think we frankly weren't necessarily anticipating, from how the pandemic has played out to some of the supply chain issues and labor shortages and all different kinds of factors that have played a significant role. The reality is, yes, I am a little surprised. I think, I was expecting to see us, well north of 20% in terms of the overall holiday for online. I think it's important to realize we're talking about sales through the channel, not necessarily the impact of the channel, but it's also interesting to see traffic down. So I think it does reflect, maybe more than I anticipated, kind of a return to kind of offline, so to speak, behaviors in North America. And we've already kind of talked about the differences between the UK and Europe. These are obviously kind of preliminary. We aren't all the way through the holiday season yet. We will see, obviously, the impact of some of the recent news coming out of the Thanksgiving weekend with Omicron and some of the other things happening, and late shopping behavior potentially as well, having some impact. I think that favors larger online retailers and aggregators who have the infrastructure and inventory to fulfill. And it may put a lot of pressure on smaller retailers and brands to execute. We'll have to see. But I guess the short answer is yes, I am a little surprised. I'm not surprised to see the average order size so significantly higher, given everything that we've seen. But I think that's also, in a sense, impacting overall sales. It accounts for a big chunk of the overall sales increase, first and foremost. And in a sense, we have to recognize that there has been, in a sense, a somewhat of a shift back, perhaps more than I anticipated, to pre-pandemic shopping behaviors. But as I said, with the recent news, we'll have to see how that plays out for the rest of the season yet to be accounted for here in these numbers.
Yeah. Jason, what about you? Anything surprised you this holiday season?
Well, one thing that's really surprising me is I feel inclined to defend Brian Walker, which seems really weird to me.
We keep people honest on this webinar.
Yeah, Michelle, I'm not sure you understand how forecasts work, but you throw lots of wild ideas out, and when they're occasionally right, you brag about them for the rest of the year. And when most of the time they're wrong, you never bring them up again. So I feel like that's a huge breach of decorum right there. But that aside, I'm going to go even much closer to the end of the season and say I'm still mostly bullish for the overall holiday season. It's with all of the variables going on and all the uncertainty and, a bunch of unfulfilled demand to get out of the house the first half of the season. And now concerns about new variants and new lockdowns kicking in that are making people less inclined to go out. Like the whole in-store versus online ratio is kind of up in the air. But in general, if you think about it, pre-pandemic, you would expect retail to grow 3 or 4% a year. You'd expect digital to grow 10 to 15% a year. You expect aggregate holiday sales to actually grow less because it's the biggest chunk. And so the law of large numbers, like if we go back, I've looked at the last 20 holiday season, and on average, the cumulative effect of online and offline, we tend to average in this kind of like 4 to 10% a year growth rate. And I actually think we're going to end up this year all in 9 or 10% higher than last year, which was already a monster year, which will make it the biggest growth year in the last 8 years. So I actually, I think there's a way to look at Brian's previous forecast and say that he's not wrong, but it's still playing out. The shape may look a little different than we guessed, but I think what's really important to remember is averages are dangerous, right? So on average, this is going to be a monster year for retail. It's going to be a monster year for holiday, but it's really bifurcated. There's going to be winners and losers. There's people with a bunch of endemic advantages that offset a bunch of people that are going to struggle. It's like on average, the three men on this webinar have great hair. But if you
appreciate that.
Yeah, if you actually look at it, two of us aren't doing that well. So that's the. So thanks for bringing up the average, Ian.
Yeah, indeed. One other point, going back to looking at 2019 versus 2020, we do have to acknowledge like U.S. online, sales up 40% from 2019. That is massive. Again, we were already at a relative maturity in online penetration compared to where, of course, we were, many years ago. When you put 40% growth off of 2019 baseline, that's a ridiculously high number. So it really is about comping last year. So the fact that we're still at 12% growth, that's pretty remarkable. It isn't where I necessarily anticipated, as I just shared, but we do need to put it in perspective. And again, I think things are still playing out, and I think we're going to see in the last couple of weeks of the holiday season, many people like yourself, Michelle, looking to fulfill demand and really gravitating to a digital first strategy, even if you end up, fulfilling through stores. And we just need to keep that in perspective as well.
Very good points. It will be interesting to see how the rest of the season pans out. So I would like to shift us over now to a subset of all the things we've been talking about and look specifically at retail. So Ian, can you go ahead and share that data, please?
Definitely. So let's look at some of the key retail sectors, starting with apparel. And for apparel, sales were up 0.71% year over year in November. However, traffic and conversion rates were down. Traffic was down 7.62% year over year, and conversion rates were down 1.14% year over year. Average order size, however, was up 10.31% year over year. Now let's take a look at luxury, which has seen a lot of change in 2021, but it's good to see that sales were actually up quite a significant 33.86% year over year in November. Traffic was also up 26.70% year over year. And another interesting point to note is that the on-site search term Tory Burch was actually a top luxury search term during the holiday season. Now, lastly, let's look at home improvements and home furnishings. Home improvement sales were up 14.67% year over year. And I have to note that they were up a very significant 108% year to date. Now, traffic, however, was down 17.94% year over year in November. And average order size is again up a very significant 83.5% year over year, as well as 122% year to date. For home furnishing, we see that sales were actually down 5.63% year over year. And traffic was down a notable 44.57% year over year in November. Now, average order size was, however, up 5.52% year over year. So with those key retail sectors covered, I'll pass it back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Ian. Let's start with apparel, because I was maybe a little bit surprised by these numbers. Maybe that's because I equate all online shopping to clothing, which is how I use it. But Brian, what is your take on apparel performance?
My perspective on this is that apparel as a category just continues to struggle a bit, and I think it reflects still remote work trends. Like, we haven't seen a dramatic return to office. There has, of course, been some, maybe the sort of interest in replenishing wardrobes. And, I know that I, in a sense, feel that urge, but consumers continue, I think, to kind of lag the demand that we may have originally anticipated. And certainly with holiday, we would expect, sweaters and pajamas, and we see that reflected in certainly the search terms in some respects, but it is, I think, as a category, somewhat lagging. There's also some demographic impacts and taste impacts that I think continue to impact the category. What would not be reflected in these numbers, for example, would be second use clothing and a focus on that with maybe a younger consumer who tends to drive the apparel category, whereas older demographics, don't replace their clothing at the same rate. And in a sense, we see in a kind of a flattening of demand, I think, reflected in many of these numbers. But it is surprising that it is, as in a sense, weak as we see here. And it's a category that's kind of gone through some bumpy rides, through the pandemic. We saw pretty dramatic improvement earlier the year, but now, somewhat soft. So I think it's interesting to see. I don't know that I, can really reflect all the different, tastes and fashion impacts that might be playing out in the numbers, but I think there's some macro trends that are reflected in these numbers.
Yeah, interesting points on demographics as well. Jason, the pandemic really seemed to have fueled conversations about the blending of the physical and the digital shopping experiences, and retail, of course, is where a lot of those conversations take place. So I'm curious, what do you think we can expect from retailers in terms of these hybrid strategies moving forward?
Yeah, well, the digital has obviously been a big winner in the pandemic, and those behaviors were accelerated. But the element of digital that by far has won has been this omni-channel digital, this curbside pickup. And all indications are that that's a permanent new shopping habit, that's an amenity that people wanted. I look at examples like Walmart used to have this automated pickup station in every store. They uninstalled all those and they're remodeling their parking lots with much bigger curbside pickup. Target has doubled the amount of parking space they dedicate to curbside pickup. Those are not things you do for temporary pandemic responses. Those are things you do because you've made the decision that your consumers permanently have demand for this new modality. And underlying all of this, over the last 2 years, Amazon has opened more fulfillment center space than Walmart has opened in their entire history, right? So Amazon has this insurmountable advantage in putting stuff in warehouses that are close to consumers. And so the response, the way every other retailer has to respond to that, is using all of their store footprints as warehouse locations, as edge caching for getting all those goods close to the consumer. And so that, like, for most retailers, that experience is going to be a survival imperative. They did it with paper clips and chewing gum last year, but I think next year is going to be a big year of them operationalizing a lot of that and hardening it and making it more operationally efficient.
Yeah, I think we see that reflected, for example, in the home improvement category, where we continue to see growth in online sales. A significant portion of that demand is going to be fulfilled through physical store locations, with bay or curbside pickup, if you will. But it reflects now a pivot to a digital first strategy in a category that wasn't that way, obviously, pre-pandemic. And it's interesting that the significant growth of those numbers, again, is annualizing a significant growth from last year. So we're seeing, just continued acceleration in that category. Certainly, the home furnishings category, I think, in a sense, has kind of run a bit of its course, perhaps. We saw just tremendous growth in that category sustain through early 2021. And now maybe it's a shift. Now, maybe that reflects kind of the transition into gift giving versus buying for myself and my family. Maybe we'll see that somewhat return, but we see that, that was a pretty significant, shift, compared to earlier this year in that home furnishings category specifically.
I had wanted to touch on the home furnishings numbers, but now that you're there, I'd also like to shift over to luxury, which those numbers, we've talked about this on previous Commerce Pulse calls as well. Those numbers continue to rise. do either of you have any thoughts on when that trend will maybe slow down a bit, or what this means about consumer habits right now?
Well, there's at least two really favorable headwinds for luxury. So we talked a little bit about, a lot of favorable economic indicators. It really has been a bifurcated economy. And so, relatively affluent people have done amazing in the pandemic. The stock market is way up. Employment for high wage earners is actually up 10% from the pandemic levels. So, and wages are way up. So we're making more, saving more. Rich people have more to spend, and rich people spend it on luxury. So that's been a very favorable trend. And then combined with that, a ton of luxury gets sold to international visitors. And so when airplanes are landing from foreign countries, luxury sales in New York City and in Chicago are way up. When there's lockdowns for pandemic, luxury gets really hurt. And like, frankly, domestic luxury in China gets a big boost. So, leading up to this, we've kind of had an opening of the borders. And a month ago, we were just announcing how much easier it was to fly to the US. That's all favorable to luxury. Like the announcements this week, and you need a COVID test within 24 hours, and London's closed. All these kind of things are likely to swing that pendulum a little bit again.
Yeah, and luxury, it's also important to realize, went through a pretty significant dip earlier in the pandemic. And now I think in some ways we don't have the comp numbers for 2019 reflected in what we shared here. And I'm not sure what they are off the top of my head, but I think in some ways we've just seen kind of a return. But it is really, occasions, it's gatherings, it's return to work. And as Jason said, it's travel that drives that category. And, I think we see that reflected in the November numbers, particularly, I think, driven from the US and the UK. But we will have to see how some of the more recent news and challenges, again, present maybe some headwinds to that category.
Yeah, well, that's great, and a good segue as we look forward into this next section, because it's pretty hard to believe, but 2021 is almost over. So for our final section today, I really just wanted both of you to share your thoughts for the year ahead. So whether that be a concrete outlook, as I know Brian likes to give, or some thoughts on trends you expect to see in the new year. Jason, if we could start with you, what are you seeing for 2022?
Sure. So I'll start with the safest predictions, and I'll move to more risky ones. Brian and I's hair is going to thin for sure. Brian's going to get a bunch of his predictions wrong for sure. I feel confident about those two. Beyond that, two things I'm watching a lot. I alluded to this earlier, but we had all this accelerated digital demand over the last 2 years. And people were just thrilled to get the sales and capture as many customers as possible. I really think 2022 is going to be a year of focus on profitability. And so I think there's going to be a lot of investment catch up in the infrastructure to deliver all these customers experiences more profitably, in optimization to optimize these sales to make them more profitable. So I think you're going to see all of those supply chain efficiencies, pricing efficiencies, customer experience efficiencies. It really is going to be the year of optimization. And then the new experience that comes up the most often with the most of my clients is really what I'll call distributed commerce. And that is folks buying stuff from more places than the website of the seller, right? And so, most notably that social commerce, and particularly live streaming commerce, that's commerce embedded in media. It's a lot of syndicated shopping experiences across, more micro moments in our life, and less, all coming to a big shopping destination to buy everything. And so I think that I'm not saying it's going to be a huge economic year for that stuff, but I think we're going to see a lot more pilots and test and learning and investment in infrastructure for those things in the coming year.
Yeah, certainly something we've talked about here at Bloomreach as well, making that entire customer journey shoppable and the importance of that. So Brian, what about you? What are your 2022 thoughts?
Well, I think everyone is hoping for maybe a more stable landscape in which to operate and enable people to kind of catch up. But everyone's struggling with labor and staffing challenges. We're going to see an increased focus on automation. We're going to see an increased focus on leveraging the data to drive optimizations across the landscape, and that includes back office operations, as Jason talked about. It also includes how you market and engage customers and serve customers. I fully agree that we're sort of moving into the next phase in a sense of a digital first strategy, and in a sense that plays out, as Jason was talking about, by embedding commerce into other experiences and starting to experiment with a variety of those. Social commerce isn't necessarily new, but it hasn't really been able to scale efficiently, and especially for businesses with large SKU counts and large catalogs. We also see a really dramatic shift and this is actually reflected in some of the numbers we have, which we didn't necessarily share earlier, which is really around the direct relationship with the consumer, and in a shift from customer acquisition to customer retention. Direct site traffic up 90%, by far the biggest growth in any one sort of traffic category. Paid search is down. Social is holding its own, but not necessarily growing dramatically. And those recent numbers reflect, I think, a trend that we'll see play out even further next year. And that's building on hopefully, all these new customers you've gotten to engage through digital, or customers you were engaging in other channels now engaging through digital, and really, striving for a sustainable, profitable customer relationship that actually, serves what the customer is looking for from you and your brand, and reflecting those interests. Yes, data privacy protection and some of the changes that we've seen with Apple iOS and more explicit permissioning and the reduction in use of third-party cookies and retargeting and all of these things also play a role in this shift. So I think one of the key things we can look for next year is businesses really investing in that direct relationship with the customer, which is digital first, even if you're looking to drive behavior across multiple other channels. I agree with Jason, further experimentation, with some of these emerging channels. And I would even include, AR and VR and embedding commerce into virtual environments as things people will be looking to test, some of which may not necessarily hit scale next year, but we'll see increased experimentation. And then we have to understand that we're not really through this period of turbulence with the pandemic still, in a sense, hard to predict the impact of it. And so I think a lot of businesses will remain somewhat conservative in how they look to operate into at least the first half of next year. And of course, most of those bets have already been placed, right, with the supply chain, for most businesses reflecting a 6 to 9 month lead time. So, I think we'll see some conservative kind of forecasts for a lot of businesses looking to drive profitable growth, preserve the gains they've had in margin, or recoup some of the challenging, margin impacts they've had related to labor cost increases, operational cost increases, supply chain increases, and overall inflationary pressure. So we're in a kind of, I think, a still a very turbulent period that if I were running a business, a lot of factors to weigh. But Jason's key point there around optimization, I think, is probably the principal one. I just think it'll be reflected in a lot of different parts of the business.
Well, optimization sounds like a good place to end. Thank you for those 2022 thoughts. I know all of us are very eager to see what the next year holds. And whatever those trends may be, we will be ready to discuss them on our next Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable, which will take place in March 2022. Details for that event will be included in the follow-up email that everyone will receive after this event. I want to thank Brian and Jason for their time today and for all the great insights that they've shared with us. If you would like to hear more from Jason, you can check out retailgeek.com, where you can access a ton of great information on retail and e-commerce, as well as Jason's podcast, The Jason and Scott Show, a weekly podcast about the e-commerce industry. And you can also visit the Publicis website for more information on them. If you'd like to hear more from Brian, you can visit the Bloomreach website, where you can find his podcast, The State of Commerce Experience, as well as his monthly Commerce Pulse blogs, which highlight the data and trends like those you've heard here today. So with that, we would like to wish all of you watching a very happy holiday season. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next quarter.
Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Be well, everyone.